The project was never finished because my writing schedule was interrupted by the events of 9/11 in 2001. But earlier that year, I'd been recruited to write religious education materials for Christian Sunday school youth about the Holocaust. I had visited the Holocaust Museum and the Children's Holocaust Museum in Jerusalem once in the early 1980s and again in the early 1990s. But I took the first part of my writing grant to visit the Holocaust Museum in Washington, D.C. At the time, a part of their display was called the Righteous Gentiles, or the Wall of the Righteous Gentiles. I think it's been renamed now, the Righteous Among the Nations. It was a collection of commemorations of non-Jewish people who had helped European Jews to escape the Nazis' final solution. It appealed to my mind that for young people attending a Christian Sunday school, the best way for them to relate to the Holocaust would be to imagine the kind of role that they might have played had they been living in Europe during the Holocaust. To provoke them to question themselves, what would I have done if I had been living in Germany or in Poland or in Russia at the time? I read several biographies of righteous Gentiles in preparation, the most famous of which was certainly Oskar Schindler, about whom the award-winning 1993 movie Schindler's List was made. But the story that has stuck with me the most clearly over the past 20 years was the story of a young Polish nursing student, Irene Gut. Her autobiography, In My Hands, is one of the most compelling yet disturbing books that you will ever read. I highly recommend it, but like reading Elie Wiesel's book, Night, you may find it difficult to be alone for a while after you read it. It's a war biography, and so the story is, well, it's just horrible from the first pages. She was a 17-year-old Catholic Polish student when she was recruited to care for Polish soldiers, but then she was captured by the Russian army, where she was repeatedly raped. If you've ever had a teenage daughter, these pages are almost impossible to read. Her account of this chapter of her life always comes back to me with nauseating clarity whenever I hear about the war crimes of Russian soldiers in the Ukraine today. She was taken to a Russian hospital to be treated for her injuries, but even there, she was going to be sexually assaulted again, and she managed to escape, fleeing back to her home in Poland, only to be rounded up by the Germans and sent to work in a slave factory manufacturing weapons for the war. But she used her German name and German appearance and her mastery of the German language to get out of that camp, but she was forced to be a housekeeper for a German officer and to work in a hotel restaurant where German officers ate. From there, she could look out the second-story windows and see into the Jewish ghetto. Now, folks, a lot of Polish Catholics saw what was happening to the Jews. They knew about the war crimes, even if they could not yet imagine the murders on the scale the Germans were planning. But some people in Poland were actually sympathetic with the extermination of the Jews. Other people tried not to think about it and tried very hard to not get involved. Irene describes a scene she witnessed from the window one day. As I pressed against the glass, I saw an officer making a flinging movement with his arm, and something rose up in the sky like a fat bird. With his other hand, he aimed his pistol, and the bird plummeted to the ground beside its screaming mother. And the officer then shot the mother too. But it was not a bird. It was not a bird. It was not a bird. The Germans could commit such horrible war crimes because they no longer saw their Jewish prisoners as being human. They were other. They were different. And so they could be despised, and as in this case, even literally killing a baby for sport. Irene's mind wanted it to be a man shooting a bird, but she kept saying to herself, but it was not a bird. It was not a bird. It was not a bird. I hesitate to draw too many comparisons to the Holocaust because, seriously, folks, nothing is like the Holocaust. But you know, we hear about a shooting in a poor neighborhood here in our town, and we don't react the way that we would have reacted if the shooting had happened on our street. Because the people who live in poor neighborhoods, am I going too far to say that they seem somehow to be other? We read about the police breaking up a homeless encampment and taking what belongings they have, their IDs, their birth certificates, their driver's license, their social security cards, whatever photos or correspondence they may have managed to save from a time when their lives had more meaning for them, something that reminded them of when they were seen as being fully human, and the police bag all that stuff up and throw it away, as if to make the point that the homeless are not so much people as they are vermin, a drain on our social services, a blight on a neighborhood, and a threat to local commerce. Irene eventually becomes a freedom fighter, smuggling Jews out of detention and helping them to escape. But she emphasizes that she did not become that person all at once. She was still a teenager, a waitress for German officers. But she had to clean their plates and scrape their leftovers into a garbage can. So she began very timidly, very carefully, just setting aside some of the better food waste scraps and putting them into a little tin box. And at night, when she took out the garbage, she would carry that little box over to the fence between the hotel and the ghetto and bury it just beneath the fence, making sure that one of the captive Jews saw her. They retrieved the box and put the empty box back where they had found it. This became Irene's ritual, daily putting food scraps under the fence. It was a drop in the bucket. Honestly, it couldn't have made much of a difference, but it allowed her to, in part, assuage her own guilt, but more importantly, it allowed her to continue to see the Jewish captives as being humans. She found herself being given more and more responsibility in the restaurant, and when she pleaded for help, she managed to persuade her captors to let her have the assistance of some of the Jewish prisoners in the kitchen. Moving 4 or 5 people back and forth daily allowed her to raise the stakes on how much food she was smuggling into the ghetto, as well as news and letters in and out as the prisoners came to help her work. She eventually made the very difficult decision to become a mistress to the German officer in whose home she lived, in exchange for him pretending not to know that she was hiding a large Jewish family in his basement. And from there, she managed to smuggle them out to freedom. At some point, having been raised an ardent and obedient Catholic, she confessed all of this, the stealing of food, the smuggling of Jews out of the ghetto, and even sleeping with a German officer, to her priest in the church's confessional. And the priest predictably condemned her for all of it. He insisted that she stop helping the Jews, that she stop stealing food and giving sexual favors, which is when she realized how irrelevant her Catholic faith had become in wartime, in the midst of a Holocaust. Irene did survive the war. She eventually moved to the United States, had a family of her own, and she actually just died in California in 2003 at the age of 81, having remained in touch with several of the Jews that she had helped to escape from certain death. Another author I read a good deal of was the Jewish psychoanalyst Viktor Frankl, who survived the Auschwitz Nazi death camp, even though his parents, his brother, and his pregnant wife did not survive. I apologize for even showing you such horrible pictures of Frankl, along with the emaciated bodies of the men with whom he was imprisoned. But it was in this nearly deathly nightmare that Frankl imagined himself standing at a lectern delivering lectures on the psychology of the death camps. He clung to a quote from the German philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche, who said, "He who has a why to live can bear with almost any how." That is, if you have a reason, if the future demands something of you, then almost any circumstances you're placed in, you can survive. He saw the difference between the prisoners who did have something to live for and those who did not, recognizing that focusing on the fact that the world still expected something from them helped to keep many of them alive. Simply enduring the suffering was not, and I argue is not, enough. We need something larger to hold on to, a family that needs you, a book that demands to be written, a story that must be told, some accomplishment that simply cannot be dismissed. Those thoughts have lived with me since we first heard of the Russian invasion of Ukraine, with the stories of murder and rape and theft of the property of civilians. And in spite of the horror of it all, the courage and resilience that has been shown by the Ukrainian people. The war is not going well for them right now, and they may not be able to withstand the invading Russian armies much longer, but you will recall the whole world, including me, assumed that Russia would have taken Ukraine in the first week of April, and it is now late June. They are surviving by their commitment to survive. Frankl reflected in one of his books about his experience in Auschwitz that Freud had believed that under the right circumstances, virtually everyone would become a monster. Given enough suffering, enough hunger, thirst, deprivation, assault, the monster that lies within all of us will appear. And you have to admit, there's a lot of evidence to support Frankl's belief. You know, the ovens in the death camps where millions of Jews were killed were operated by other Jewish prisoners. They assisted in killing their own people in order to buy themselves a little more time, maybe a little more comfort, better rations, or better clothing. Hard times can reveal our very worst character. But Frankl noted that it could also reveal previously unknown saints, angelic human beings who would share their crust of bread with the starving prisoner, who might give up some of their own clothing or even their shoes to save someone who was dying from the cold. In his most famous book, the one that I wish everyone would read, Man's Search for Meaning, Frankl writes, "Sigmund Freud once asserted, 'Let anyone attempt to expose a number of the most diverse people uniformly to hunger, with the increase of the imperative urge of hunger, all individual differences will blur, and in their stead will appear the uniform expression of the one unstilled urge.' Thank heaven Sigmund Freud was spared knowing the concentration camps from the inside. His subjects lay on a couch designed in the plush style of Victorian culture, not in the filth of Auschwitz. There, the individual differences did not blur, but on the contrary, people became more different. People unmasked themselves, both the swine and the saints." Despair, depression, cynicism can be the escapes that we use to avoid dealing with hard times, if we are not the one who is at the tip of the spear. I will confess to you these past 2 years have been hard on me psychologically, as we have endured the regressive policies of the Trump administration, which ended in a horrible and deadly pandemic, in which most of our neighbors refused to be vaccinated or to even wear a paper mask to protect the lives of the vulnerable around them. We have watched our often obscenely religious neighbors demonstrating depraved indifference about the welfare of children and the elderly around them. And even our own government seems determined to take away the civil rights of women, to cut funds used to prop up food and education programs, and to defend gun manufacturers' profits, even in the face of one mass murder after another, in schools, in churches, in shopping centers and bars. And yet, even our Supreme Court still sides with gun manufacturers instead of the safety of children. I recognize depression as if it were literally a person living very near to me, longing to embrace me and hold me in its frozen bosom. Soren Kierkegaard once wrote in his journal, "My depression has become my most faithful mistress. Is it any wonder, then, that I return her affection?" I have friends now who speak of moving to Canada. My old scuba buddy has often mentioned moving to Iceland, and at times I have considered leaving the country permanently myself. I just can't believe how corrupt our Supreme Court has become. I cannot stand the fact that our country has been so willing to go backwards in matters of race, of gender, of civil rights, the environment, and in economics. I fight depression. I fight it with exercise, with exposure to nature. I fight it by conversation with friends whom I know will share my concerns, and I can be confident that they have similar passions. But I would be lying to you if I did not admit that none of these things work every day. I spend sleepless nights. I have spent a day here and there, literally closed up in my bedroom, away from the world, and even closing the drapes to keep the light of the sun away from me, wallowing in despair. You don't need for me to tell you how often we turn to watching sports or mindless sitcoms or pure escapist drama as if an English accent and period costumes can anesthetize our awareness of how much is going seriously wrong in the world. We call it entertainment when it really isn't that, is it? It's really just distraction. As if simply not watching the news could mean that our democracy is not under a very real threat of falling into fascism at the hands of our own elected officials. Though I am always reticent to compare any current event to the whole Nazi movement and the resulting Holocaust that took place in the first half of the 20th century, none of us can escape the fact that Russia's virtual dictator, Vladimir Putin, is acting like Hitler. And the Russian armies are committing the kinds of war crimes against the people of the Ukraine that the German armies committed in Poland 80 years ago. This is further compounded by the fact that our former president was publicly supportive of Putin as well as the violent royal family of Saudi Arabia, and he was publicly envious of China's president, Xi Jinping, who changed China's constitution so that he could remain president for life, something which our former president was attempting to accomplish for himself. So yes, if you are at all awake to what is going on in the world and in our own country, depression may very well become your most faithful mistress. However, I don't think this is the time to just call your doctor and get your prescription for Prozac refilled, nor simply to escape the country physically or figuratively by diving deeply into various forms of diversion. You need to realize that the future expects something of you. You have a reason to live, which can empower you to survive the serious challenges we now face. As Elie Wiesel taught us in his account of surviving the Holocaust, we cannot simply be neutral because neutrality favors the oppressor and never the oppressed. We must take sides. We are not spectators of life. We are participants. We are decision makers, and we can be world changers. Or as one of my favorite internet memes says, you can pray all you want, but eventually David had to pick up a stone and act against Goliath. Don't simply be depressed. Be determined. Maybe even be angry, but be sure you're not neutral. Vote. And maybe even be an election judge. I am. I do it. It's tedious. It's boring. But if we want to have reliable elections, we have to have persons of conscience involved. or you can campaign. You may even consider running for office yourself. Be vocal. Be public about your convictions. Sure, be kind, but don't play dumb just to make other people feel more comfortable. Democracy, with all of its freedoms and civil rights, are in more danger today than at any time since Japan bombed Pearl Harbor, and there will be no awards handed out for just being sad about losing our democracy. Now is the time for spiritual people to be more than simply concerned. Now is the time for us to be engaged. Thank you.
Thank you for watching our videos. We are entirely dependent on the donations of our listeners and members. We hope that you find this content to be important enough to help us to keep offering these videos to the public at no charge by becoming a regular contributor. Please click on the donate button on our website at www.spfccc.org. Thank you for your support of progressive religious programming.